So welcome everyone to our event, Truth and Decolonization panel discussion. My name is Josephine Barron, and I am the Director of Outward Bound Canada's Training Academy for Outdoor Professionals. I'm pleased to be your host today. So I'm located in Edmonton, which is Treaty 6 territory, homeland of Métis Nation Region 4, and traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Dene, Iroquois, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi, Métis, Inuit, and Nakota Sioux. As an immigrant to Canada, I'd never heard the name of Indigenous peoples, residential schools, or even what a treaty was. And when I was introduced to this through high school, it was talked about in the past tense and framed as something that was not relevant to today. Certainly, I never heard of the 60s scoop or understood that treaties provide a framework for living together and sharing the land. So my perspective has continued to evolve as I've intentionally chosen to learn and listen. And through this, I was fortunate to encounter the words of Richard Wogamies, a recognized Ojibwe author from Northwestern Ontario. So I wanted to take a moment just to share some of his words. All that we are is story. From the moment we are born to the time we continue on our spirit journey. We are involved in the creation of our story here. It is what we arrive with. It is all that we leave behind. We are not the things that we accumulate. We are not the things we deem important. We are story, all of us. What comes to matter then is the creation of the best possible story we can while we're here. You, me, us together. When we can do that, and we take the time to share those stories with each other, we get bigger inside. We see each other. We recognize our kinship. We change the world, one story at a time. So by acknowledging the land, it is my hope that together we can weave richer, deeper stories that lift all voices. So I do have a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to share before we get started. We are recording this event, so we will post it on our YouTube account for you to review later if you wish to share it with someone or if you have to pop out a bit early. The panel discussion will be about 60 minutes in length, and due to the size of the audience, there is no chat feature. We also have a limited time, so we won't have the opportunity for a Q&A with our guests today. I'd like to make a few other introductions before we get started to Outward Bound Canada and the Training Academy. Outward Bound Canada is a registered charity. It offers programs that build resilience and empower youth through experiential adventures in nature. Since 1969, more than 200,000 participants have experienced our unique high-impact programs from coast to coast. Many of the youth who complete our programs, either as individuals or through their school, are underserved with outdoor education and need our scholarships and bursaries. Launched in 2022, the Training Academy, an initiative of Outward Bound Canada, was created to address the representation gap by diversifying those who work in the outdoor sector. It offers training in both technical skills and social and emotional competencies in a safe and inclusive environment. This program is generously funded by the Government of Canada's Sectoral Initiatives Program as an investment in the outdoor sector's economic recovery. So why are we hosting today's event? One of the goals of the Training Academy is to diversify the outdoor sector. And a large part of that is listening and learning from other people's diverse lived experiences and their perspectives. Today's event is an important opportunity to provide a platform to Indigenous leaders within the outdoor sector to amplify, learn from, and understand their varied perspectives. So we hope that this event inspires you to learn about and take constructive steps towards truth and reconciliation in Canada's outdoor sector. Without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce to you today's moderator, Jessie Fiddler-Kiss, who is a member of Métis Nation of Alberta. Her family comes from the Métis homeland in Saskatchewan and Treaty 7 territory in southern Alberta. She's grateful to be a guest on Treaty 7 territory. Jessie is a top 40 under 40 2022 awardee for founding the Moss Bag Project, an Indigenous-led nonprofit that funds scholarships and educational resources for Indigenous mothers and two-spirit parents. Jessie is the principal and facilitator of Fiddler-Kiss Consulting and has worked in the fields of education, Indigenous pedagogy, and land-based leadership for nearly 2 decades. She is writing a thesis on anti-racism at the University of Saskatchewan. Jessie is a retired Olympic oval athlete, a University of Saskatchewan Husky ice hockey alumna, and Mount Royal University athlete, and was recognized by her university as a business leader. Please welcome today the moderator for Truth and Decolonization panel, Jessie Fiddler-Kiss.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Josephine. I want to welcome everyone today and again, say thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity for all of us to gather here today. Can everyone hear me? Sorry, I thought I heard some feedback. Oh, okay. Yeah, this feels really special and timely for all of us to gather here to talk about land-based education and have space to share it through our lens. So how we'll begin today is with an introduction of our panelists. And I wanted to share something that I think is important before we begin listening to the panelists and all their brilliance, is that when you're listening to both our questions and our answers, I want everybody today to put on, or try to put on, a different lens. Our relationship and Indigenous people's relationship with the land has a kinship. We're kin with the land. It's like an unconditional caregiver to us. And so when we're speaking about education and I don't even know what the right word is, but not using the land, but being a part of the land to educate others, we don't see it as something to consume or extract or live upon. We're a part of it. And so as you're listening to the panelists today, try, it's a practice, and put those lenses on as you're hearing some of their answers. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. So first is Kathi Camilleri. I need to move the screen over because I can't read your whole bio. There we go. Okay, Kathi Camilleri, or Spotted Doe, is of Métis Cree ancestry, and she has a master's degree in leadership studies and certificates in CBT and DBT. She leads strategic planning sessions, keynote lectures, and experiential village workshops on Canada's policy of assimilation and colonization with all levels of government, students, educators, and frontline workers in communities across Canada. In 2012, her work was nominated for the Premier's Award for Excellence in Leadership, the BC Reconciliation Award, and the Nasika Foundation's Excellence in Diversity Award. Welcome, Kathi. Thank you for being here. Next is Troy Paternaude. He's a PhD, a scholar, AC, MG hiking guide, curator, land-based educator who spent his life exploring the intersection of nature, art, and social change. He is from the Georgian Bay Métis community around the Upper Great Lakes and has lived most of his life in Blackfoot, or the Sukanaxa territories throughout the Rocky Mountains. He has guided and helped facilitate cross-cultural sharing and educational programs with Outward Bound Canada, Ghost River Rediscovery, and Cross River Education and Retreat Center. Troy also teaches settler colonial studies and decolonization courses at the Alberta University of the Arts. Thank you, Troy. Okay. Our next panelist is Meredith Martin. Meredith Martin is of Coast Salish ancestry with, I should have asked you how to pronounce this, not just your name, the Sinunemuxwa First Nation. I hope that was, I did my best to honor that. And she was given the traditional name of Zuwalapia, and she holds a bachelor's of Fine Arts from the Emily Carr University of Art and Design and a master's in counseling psychology from Adler School of Professional Psychology. She has worked on the Aboriginal outreach team for child and youth mental health for many years and has co-facilitated the building of bridges through understanding the village workshops with Kathi Camilleri for the past 16 years. She has also worked as an eating disorder therapist at Island Health for several years. Now retired, she remains involved as a board member of the Comox Valley Transition Society and the Beaufort Family Health Society. Thank you, Meredith. I look forward to chatting with you today. Okay, and finally, this is Robert Burns. Robert's traditional name is Suwilaxia Galliux, which means learner of our history or knowledge of the Skeena River, which when I first read that, I thought was the most beautiful name. He comes from the Gixon First Nation and the Heiltsuk First Nation. And for the past 10 years, his work has focused on community development and meaningful youth programs. And he currently works at the Land Back Adventure Program as a coordinator at the Kelowna Friendship Center in Kelowna, BC. He's also a fourth-year student at the University of British Columbia in the Bachelor of Arts, First Nations, and Indigenous Studies program. So, welcome, Robert. I look forward to chatting with you today. Just a tiny piece of housekeeping before we begin, just a reminder to our panelists, we have 3 minutes to answer questions. So I'll ask, and then I'll request someone to begin, and then you have 3 minutes. And I believe that Alan, the man behind the scenes, will be raising his hand at roughly the 1 minute mark, and then you have a minute to 30 seconds to wrap up your idea. Yeah, so we can begin. Okay. Intro. So I know we had chatted before about some of the creation of these questions, and so we're familiar with what questions we are going to be discussing today. But if there's at any point someone wants me to repeat it or add to it, please just ask. Okay. I'm hoping this feels more like a conversation, kind of like the one we had last time with laughs and warmth and openness and vulnerability. So let's begin. So first question is, how has Indigenous erasure impacted your life? Let's just start with Meredith, because you were number 1 in the bio, in the panelist bio. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I think when I thought of that question, what comes to mind the strongest is a life with lacking a sense of belonging. I was not raised with my culture, and in that process, it has been very difficult to find who I am as an Indigenous woman. I did not feel that I belonged in either world. My mother is not Indigenous. And so I walked that way, not daring to enter, especially with my father's world. I would try here and there. I would join a ceremony and then I would go and hide. It makes me feel teary thinking about it. This led me to work with Kathi and others, with some amazing elders and to learn truly what it meant to enter into my identity as an Indigenous woman. I was really gifted to walk beside some amazing elders who have been doing this work for many, many years, and to learn from them. I was privileged to receive the name Walapia, which translates to woman who belongs in the house, meaning the longhouse. And I was gifted that name to grow into that name. It was something that walks beside me, reminding me that I have a responsibility now to walk the path, to walk my true path to who I am.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a beautiful share. When I had first heard that question, I was like, ooh, there's gonna be a lot of like heavy responses, but there's a lot of beauty in your answer too. Yeah.
Thank
you. An invitation home. Thank you. Kathi.
Thank you. And it's lovely to see everybody and
Yeah.
be a part of this. It's such a wonderful time to be alive, you know, where people care to discuss truth and decolonization. And my mom walked with a lot of shame about being an Indigenous woman. You know, she would let people in front of her in the grocery store and always walked with her head down, and because of the color of her skin. And so inadvertently, she had passed that shame on down to me. You know, that shame had been placed on her and on our people through the targeting of our culture, you know, to be taken away, to be assimilated, to be erased. And so inadvertently, she had passed that shame on down to me. And so I was walking in the world much the same way as my mom, head down, never feeling like I belong. I so appreciate, Meredith, that you talked about it. You know, my self-talk is always that I don't belong. So my healing journey has brought me to understand what happened to my mother. And when I understood, I was able to forgive her in an instant some of the behaviors that she walked with in her life. And I was able to break generational cycles. Beautiful Nuu elders, when they, you know, heard my story, you know, about mom, and they brushed me with cedar, and I actually felt the shame leave me. And now I remind myself that I belong. And they said beautiful things to me, those Nuu elders. You know, they said, welcome home. Welcome home to who you really are. You should never become ashamed of the color of your skin, the ways of your culture, and the ways of your spirituality. And I really felt my shame leave, and I've stepped into relearning my culture, and I became very passionate about educating other people about what happened in this country's history, so that we can all come together and heal together. So yeah, so you know, I'm proud of my ancestors, the Marion family and the Latterrood families, um, and I feel them with me today. So it's lovely to see you all, and I'm grateful that we're having this discussion. And so many people have cared to come in and learn together with all of us as we grow and move forward.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful answer. Yeah. Robert, do you need me to repeat the question?
No, I'm definitely in a, I'm reminded with Meredith, for one, thank you for having me. This is great to be able to be in this space and have these discussions. They're very important. And Meredith, you brought me to a place, you talked about growing into the name. Sawalaksa Galiaks is the name that I was actually given within the last couple months. It was something that I didn't plan for. It was something that found me. and I went through an interesting experience about almost coming home. And when we talk about Indigenous erasure and how it's impacted my life, I think about relationship to land, I think about relationship to community, and my name, and honoring that name, and what I will be carrying forward is definitely something that sits with me right now. But to get specific, I think growing up, my relationship to land, I grew up outside of my community. I grew up in urban settings away from home. And I grew up nomadic in a way. I was fortunate to be a guest on so many territories and to be a part of so many communities. And in some ways, I don't know whether or not it was in a way that was calling to me, because the separation from home, the path to home, was always what was calling. And to be witness to such strong communities and to be a part of their journeys to uphold their culture and their traditions and their practices is a gift that I carry with me. And I also think about representation. I think about growing up, what it meant to see people in movies, to see people as athletes, Indigenous leaders, to see those people represented before me. Because the difference for me is that I think without Indigenous leaders or role models in space, it becomes difficult to imagine yourself in those spaces. I had this discussion with other like youth leaders who we were doing programming on a mountain, and we were doing some snowboarding, and we had the realization of like where our fellow cousins, aunties, and uncles on the mountain right now? Where are the other snowboarders? We're not seeing enough people here that are represented in the space comfortably to feel like they are a part of the space. So I think it's these small interactions that grow into larger ideas and creating space for other youth. That's where a lot of my work lies. But yeah, that's what comes up for me when I think about these important topics.
Thank you. Yeah, and your name was one of the ones that I noticed like right away. Like reading it, it struck me as really connected to the land, really beautiful. So thank you for sharing the story about that. Okay, and our final panelist for this question, Troy.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for having me as well. I feel privileged to be here. I'm been asked to join this panel. Like Jessie mentioned in my bio there, I've been an Outward Bound instructor, or was an Outward Bound instructor for many years in the early 2010s. And so something like this, it feels really important and meaningful to me. I love Outward Bound and the what it can help with, and the possibilities that an organization like Outward Bound has. And I imagine, I don't know if this is true or not, but I imagine that a lot of you out in the audience I probably know. So that's kind of nice. I feel very, very honored to talk to a lot of fellow instructors and workers and people connected to Outward Bound and just the outdoor industry in general. And to the question, my really similar to the answers of everybody else, it's really Indigenous erasure for me has really impacted me very personally, in that I grew up not knowing about my own history because of that. My dad's side of the family is from the Georgian Bay Métis community, and I had to grow up not knowing about that. And it wasn't until and what that meant, and it wasn't until my early to mid-teen dad's aunts started to bring back stories and memories to our about my dad's side of the family and our ancestors, that I started to learn more about the things like how our community was moved during after the War of 1812, and moved and relocated from place to place, and had a lot of oppression and dispossession things attached to it around the creation of the border between Canada and the United States, all throughout the Upper Great Lakes area in Northern Ontario. And so it's and so on and so forth throughout the 19th century. There's lots of stories of oppression and dispossession. And so my ancestors, like a common story for a lot of Métis people, is a lot of my ancestors would marry non-Indigenous people and raise their children to not know of their Indigenous connections to people in place. And so that happened, and I went through many years. Every now and then I still get a little angry about it, but I went through many years of anger and frustration about that, because the more I learned, the more I realized that that's all by design, that I don't know who I am. And that just really, frankly, pisses me off. So it's by design that I don't know who I am. And so I try to, and that really, the silver lining of it all, I suppose, is it's made me who I am today. And I've really made it my job for the last 20 years at least, to help youth and Canadian citizens know more about our true history and why we really are the way we are, so that doesn't have to happen again for our future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy, very much. Yeah, there's some parallels in my family history as well, around the idea of removing Indigenous story and knowledge systems in order to survive, right? It's a racist system. And so in order to survive, that happened often, right? Okay, so our next question is about your relationship with the land. And I wanted to start with a quote. This person is not Indigenous, but the quote always struck me as something that describes how I've witnessed the land in relationship. And it comes from more of an Indigenous paradigm, even though this person isn't Indigenous. So the quote is, "The land is alive and talking to us. This is not a metaphor." And this is by Terence McKenna. He's a naturalist, among other things. But I always like that idea that the land is alive and talking to us. And even though we can't understand the language, it's there, it's waiting for that relationship. So the question is, how is it that you walk with the land, and what is your relationship to our land, to our home? I don't know. Robert, let us begin.
Okay, I had a feeling there. The thing that comes up for me, and it's kind of something I begin with when I think about youth work, and when I introduce some of these youth to land-based learning. I said land is a great teacher, it's a great provider, and it's a great healer. And I think about that in terms of balance. What are the elements that feed into some of those understandings about the medicine wheel? I think about the mental, I think about the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual. How am I in balance? And for me, land is, I heard this, there's this phrase that I've kind of come back to over and over again. It's touching stone. What are the times that I need to become grounded in place? What are the times I needed to almost detach from the self in order to reconnect with the things that are around me? And I was fortunate enough a few years ago to be around friends on the land, and we were asked an important question: what does the land mean to you? And it's something that's kind of stuck with me over the years. And land is home when I want to go home, but I can't. And I think that comes back to those ideas around growing up outside of my community. I think it comes back to how I relate in place, because land is this universal communication among all of us. It's something that we share, something that we look to understand in different ways. And it's also taught me how to understand ceremony. How do we walk in ceremony? How do we be in relation to all living things on the land? And I think there's this understanding as well, in terms of how I've done my work with land-based learning, that it's not about achievement. It's not about getting to that peak or understanding that body of water, or this sense of conquering and conquest. It is that sense of connection. That's what the land is to me, and that's how I walk with the land. So that's what comes up for me.
Thank you. Thank you. Kathi.
I was born on Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan, and then my family ultimately settled as uninvited guests on the territory of the Wewicum people, and the colonial name, the settler name for where I live, is Campbell River. And you know, I'm grateful to be a guest here. And sometimes when I introduce myself, people say to me, doesn't it make you feel a bit uncomfortable referring to yourself as an uninvited guest? You know, and actually, it has the opposite effect. It feels really good to state that right up front. My original peoples weren't placed here, and what I know about myself is that I want to be a good guest wherever I go. I don't want to help myself to things that aren't mine. I want to walk, you know, humbly, with a willingness to be taught and corrected, and I have been, you know, sometimes even publicly and firmly, and actually I'm really grateful for that, because I want to be taught so that I don't breach protocol again. And there's such diversity in culture across Turtle Island, North America. We're not all the same, you know, from place to place. And really our cultures are all connected to the land, you know. My dad was from Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and he moved to the northern end of Vancouver Island, and it's into Port Hardy and on Zaki's territory. Anyway, we used to have logger friends over for dinner, and he'd say to them, you know, in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, we have trees as big around as your wrist. It wasn't impressive to the Port Hardy loggers. And those little trees, they wouldn't have been good for making big houses or long houses, but they were really good for making teepees. Teepee poles. So, you know, wherever Creator has placed our people, we use the resources of that land, and it becomes a part of our cultural identity, and we know we're home. It reminds me of a story of my brother Bob. I had 4 older brothers, and brother Bob was on an airplane, and he was flying from Vancouver Island to I don't know, I think Ottawa or something, and he, something in his spirit knew when he was flying over the homeland territory of our people. He knew that, and he started to cry in the airplane as he looked down from the airplane at that territory, you know, because that's where our ancestors are, and the animals that fed, the remains of the animals that fed, and the descendants of the animals, you know, that fed our people. So I think about relationship as well, relationship to everything. You know, David Somerville, Mohawk elder, talks about how he says, all my relations, meaning we're related to everything. We are never alone when we go into the forest, because everything is our relative. And we don't dominate, you know, have power over, but we're in relationship with. Berta Billy, the late Berta Billy, used to say, you know, it's a spiritual relationship with the land, because it's where Creator placed our people. We don't take more than we need. You know, we just take just what we need because we know if we hurt the land and the waters, it's going to hurt us. I also think, you know, I can't remember the name of the elder at a conference many, many years ago, but she said, deer know to go and lay down on the land when they're feeling tired or sick. You know, they lay down on the earth. So it's medicine. It's our mother here to look after us. And it's a reciprocal relationship we're in. We look after and we get looked after. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Meredith.
Kathi, that the dough laying down and its medicine. My childhood was very chaotic and traumatic, but I lived in a very isolated place with no other children. And so my relationship with the land as a healer, I as a child spent hours and hours out climbing trees and running up streams, and it was my solace, my best friend, my healer, and I honored it and it honored me. So it was a real relationship. When I walk now, I try to remember how deep that relationship was, because now I'm an adult and all of these responsibilities and what the land can give me. It's so easy to slide into that. And when I walk now, I purposely watch how a blade of grass lays across a rock, how the bird sounds in my ear as I'm walking. I know this may sound funny, but I really want to walk in a way that I honor this relative, because I'm not dominant. If anything, I know less on how to be in the world and how to be in relationship. The tree and the earth, that blade of grass and the rock, their relationship is true and not as fraught as how we make human relationship. And I want to be walking in a good way on this earth. I remember years ago, I connected with an uncle in the Tsunamic territory. He lived there on this beautiful piece of acreage by the river, and I'd never met him, and he wasn't very verbal, and he was a bit shy, but he took me out and he walked me around his property, and he said, that's where your cousin blah blah, and that's where that happened, and that's where that land and that place of living held who he was and who his family was and who I was. So for me, it's a sacred relationship. It's everything. And I need to really remember that in some ways I'm very much insignificant. Not insignificant, that's not the right word, but I'm not dominant, and I'm a small part of something that's really large, all my relations.
Yeah, beautiful. Hi, Troy. You're not intentionally last again. I just wanted to hear the aunties talk side by side. So, Troy.
No problem. Yeah, it's a good question, and very similar to what Kathi was saying. Actually, I spend most of my time in territory where I'm not from. I'm an uninvited guest here as well too. So I spend most of my time in Blackfoot and Tinaka territories throughout the Rocky Mountains. And so for me, it's kind of it's like a complex but really kind of beautiful balancing act that I feel like I'm always going through as my relationship to the land develops. So on the one hand, where my community is from around the Upper Great Lakes in Northern Ontario, I try as much as possible to keep learning about it and going there and visiting and you know, making sure that I'm not too much of a stranger of that area as well. But because I've lived more than, you know, most of my life here in Blackfoot and Tenaka territories in the Rocky Mountains, it's I also am aware that I'm in a place that, yeah, that I'm not really from, and so it's a different kind of a relationship I have and am working on in this part of the land. And for me, a lot of it comes down to remembering where I really am. And by that, I mean, I'm not in this place that's just called these like national or provincial national, you know, parks. That's not where I am. I'm not even in Alberta or BC. I'm in Blackfoot and Tenaka territory. That's where I am first. And so what does that mean for me? I had here I'm speaking to you right now from Blackfoot territory, and a Blackfoot friend of mine told me a few years ago, it was really interesting. I always remembered it. He said, you know, lots of people, lots of non-Blackfoot people think that they kind of know this area, or lots of people can kind of feel like they have a connection to this place if they go out spending a lot of time, say, climbing or hiking, and that kind of makes them feel like there's a level of connection there. Yes, but he says to really grow that connection and deepen it and to know where you really are, the Blackfoot ceremonies and stories and language and songs kind of have like the Wi-Fi access code to it. And without that, you're a little connected, but you're not like really connected. And that always stuck with me because it reminded me of, if everyone's seen the movie The Matrix from the 90s, you know, throughout the whole film, Keanu Reeves's character, he's like really kind of struggling like with where he really is and like what's real and what's not real, and trying to learn about what this matrix really is. And if you think of the matrix like the relationship to the land, he's constantly trying to figure out, but doesn't really get it till the end when he suddenly sees it all differently, and it's like in this code, and then he can finally move in it and get it. And I feel like it's like that with Indigenous stories, songs, ceremonies. You're really not connected unless you really know that code, and it can be a real struggle to get there, but that's part of the work. And so for me, that's kind of the way I look at it. I make a point of spending a lot of time, you know, say here on Blackfoot territory, going to Blackfoot ceremonies, visiting Blackfoot elders, knowledge keepers, learning, listening to their stories. And in a lot of cases, it's not always, in most cases, it's not always my place to regurgitate and tell these stories, but it changes the way I might talk about things and understand things and move through the land with people as a guide or an outward bound instructor.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That imagery, The Matrix, love that movie. That's actually a really good image for that, for how we would connect with the land. And like when I go to Batoche, or where my family's from in Saskatchewan, I'm just like, oh, it feels like home. And there's things I just get, you just belong. And yeah, other people don't have the code. That's really neat. Okay, so the next question is about white innocence. And when we hear white innocence, there's this like, sometimes, not all the time, but there's like a recoil. People are like, what does that mean? Like, it's almost like white fragility, white innocence, and we recoil from hearing those phrases. So when we were prepping this, I shared with the panelists that I'm a really big, very keen master's student right now. So I'm kind of super nerdy and I'm all in the readings. And so where the concept of white innocence comes from is actually foundational research from Black scholars in critical race theory. And so this one was, there's a couple, but the one I'm going to focus on is Whiteness is Property by Cheryl Harris. And she describes that people within this research paper, that Black people or people of darker skin sometimes have this ability to like shift back and forth between culture. They can hide, and I'm one of those people. And if I was to pretend that I didn't have privilege in that, then I would be using white innocence as a tool. I would be like, well, that's not me though. And so sometimes when we're, as a land-based educator, or we're investing in Indigenous education and we're trying to move things forward, innately, many of us, well, I'm going to go with almost everyone, if we've been colonized, carries racist behaviors, racist tools that allow us to step outside of being accountable to white supremacy that does exist. And so the question we have is around white innocence. So how can we adjust as land-based educators, all of us, not just Indigenous, everyone, how can we adjust or leave behind colonial perspectives on relating to the land without stepping back into, well, not me though, I'm not like that. How can we be accountable? How can we shift those practices? Big question. Troy, you get to go first this time.
All right, great. Yeah, so all the other questions I had at least the time of 3 other speakers to think about it, and now I don't on the like this petty question. Great. I was looking forward to some more time, but anyway, no, I that's all good. Yeah, when I think of white innocence, yeah, I mean, you brought up some great work there, and I guess my mind was going to the work of Eve Tuck and Kay Yang Wang and what they called settler moves to innocence. And for me, that's what it's a thing that non-Indigenous settler colonial people can do. They're like moves and actions that they can do to relieve feelings of guilt or responsibility, which can make them feel like they're doing something and caring, but without actually giving up any land, power, or privilege. And so on the one hand, it looks like, you know, and caring is a great thing, but it can look like you're doing something, but on the other hand, not really doing anything meaningful to change the settler colonial, the Indigenous non-Indigenous relationship in wherever you're working for our future generations. And so, you know, I think of it's really it's so complex. I mean, how can we do that? How can we avoid doing that? It's really, I guess it comes down to, part of it's education, you know, educating yourself on contemporary Indigenous relations, land rights issues, where you really are, but also part of its relationships. And so so don't just read a bunch of books and then think, okay, you know, I now get it. You know, having relationships with Indigenous peoples, and not just going and meeting one once or working with an Indigenous person on a project for a few months and then thinking that you got it, but like a long-standing relationship that's like being continually worked on and built over many years, you know, a relationship like that. There's that in it. There's really, and it's things like coming back to that trying to change the relationship or the balance of power over land and privilege and power in Canada in general. So that you're constantly thinking about your way of relating to the land and then critically assessing that, so that you're not replicating settler colonial harms by doing what you're doing, or yeah, learning about how power in Canada is structured is really designed to oppress Indigenous people and privilege, non-Indigenous, mainly of European descent people. So understanding that there's always an imbalance of power, and that's right through organizations, top to bottom, on the policy level, right up to internal hierarchies and the structures of working within whatever organization you work with. Those power structures are designed and have been designed for many generations, so we just kind of like grow into them. But learning about those structures can help us not fall into the same sort of traps that, again, replicate settler colonial harms.
Yeah.
And that's where my mind went.
Without having any time to think, that was really great. I'd actually love to have like more academic conversations with you about like the reading and because it's structural. It's everywhere. And I think sometimes, again, maybe it's like that code, unless you can see it.
It's the Upstream project in Kelowna. And the focus of that was a prevention program that looks to identify youth homelessness. And they do assessments to help build programs so that these youth can get connected to the services that they need. And I was fortunate to be a part of that for a few years. And year after year, it became prevalent of the consistent understanding that 32% of those youth at risk of homelessness were Indigenous, and 32% of those recognized youth at risk of homelessness were 2S LGBTQIA+. They're part of that community. And I think what that says to me is, how do we respond? The people, not only is it land, but the people that we stand with and alongside on the land. How do we respond in a way that our youth feel supported? How do we ground them in place so that we can create and redefine home? It became exactly that. We need to diversify and understand how we are working with our youth, because they're our future. And within that, it was a community effort. The Upstream project focused on non-Indigenous and Indigenous organizations working together to help support these youth. And the systems and the way that they assess things within that had to respond to the way that as an Indigenous organization, as an Indigenous community did things. How do we relate to one another? How do we bypass things like all these words like assessment? And how do we move away from words like homelessness? Because those things bring into all of these different levels of challenges and barriers that have been in place for generations. So when I think about this colonial perspective, relating to land, I think about, how do we center Indigenous knowledge? How do we work alongside one another? Because the people that we stand with on the land are also nearly as important as making sure that we're working in ceremony on the land. That's what comes up for me.
Thank you. Okay, the aunties. Kathi.
A few things come to mind, and what amazing work, by the way, you're all doing. I just want to, just share my gratitude for that. So a few things are coming to mind, and one is, Justice Sinclair. He said, when we talk about systemic racism, he said, people think that we're saying that everybody that works in those systems are racist. He said, but that's not the case at all. It's when those systems have been founded on racist policies and ways of being in the world, and now, because they haven't been addressed, the policies and procedures that are in place in those systems require even the non-racist people that work with them to behave in a racist way. when I think about, addressing, the need for systemic change, positive systemic change, to decolonize systems, to make them more like a village where we're all working together. So the other thing I think about is that the Truth and Reconciliation has really given us a good roadmap forward. I think about the 4 A's, actually. That always helps me to remember, but it's awareness of what happened in the past, and acknowledgement of the harm that has happened as a result of all of those systems being put into place. It's atonement for that pain that it's caused, and it's also then action to change behavior, to change how we walk in the world, and that comes up to us as individuals. Hey, I'm also thinking about Berta Billy, who was my mentor for the last 28 years. The late Berta Billy, she's passed away, but she tells a story about she's the woman who invited the United Church to apologize for their part in the running of residential schools. This amazing woman, first of the historic apologies, and she got up to, well, she was nervous about going. She's from Weewakai territory, small village. She was invited to the city to go speak to the upper hierarchy of the United Church, and she was nervous, so she invited a mentor of hers, and that just happened to be Chief Dan George. People don't know who he is, just Google him. The late Chief Dan George. And this is a story he told. He said, in the olden days when our people wanted to make one of our big canoes, he said they could go into the forest, they could look for one perfect cedar tree to make one of their big canoes. He said, nowadays, though, and that had to be a pretty amazing tree, hey, it had to be huge, couldn't be a leaner, straight. They'd ceremony, the tree would choose them, they would choose the tree, they would fall it very gently and make a canoe. He said, nowadays, when our people want to make one of our big canoes, he said, we go in, we look for one perfect cedar tree, we can't find them, they're logged or protected's good. He said, nowadays, when we want to make one of our big canoes, we go into the forest and we look for two perfect cedar trees, 2 trees that will come together. And Berta used to hold her hands up like that and say, we need to come together so perfectly that you don't even see the seam. So of course, what Berta and Chief Dan George are teaching us is that, it's time for us to come together as relatives. All of us come from a people that have undergone the trauma of colonization, and to find out, how did your people cope with that trauma? How is that trauma passed down generation to generation? And, there's no room in this canoe called reconciliation, together as relatives, there's no room for shame in it. We come together as relatives. To figure out how we're going to move this canoe called reconciliation towards the vision of reconciliation that we're all going to come together, up with together as relatives. As individuals pick up a paddle of responsibility to the generations that are going to follow us, because we don't force people in the canoe. We'll figure out how we're going to pull that canoe forward to the vision of reconciliation that we come up with together as relatives. So, I think that the path is fairly clear forward to us, but the understanding of privilege because of the color of skin, is such an important thing to do. And, in that canoe, we have really good conversations. Learning conversations. Sometimes they even involve emotion and healing work. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other auntie.
Whoa, after all that, I get to speak. So where I went when I thought of this question at first was about systems and about the difficulty in changing systems. Years and years ago, Kathi and I were hired to work for a system and to do things differently for Indigenous families, children, and youth. And it was one of the most difficult things I've ever tried to do, was to work within a system to make change. I don't have any answers at all. Um, other than what I'm really encouraged about is I see children and youth learning, non-Indigenous children and youth learning and taking their parents to task. And I think that's where our future is. It's so difficult to shift your worldview when it's been embedded in you. And we've done this work with so many amazing people, and they come and go, I didn't know, so the innocence, but it's from a really heartfelt place. What can I do? That's a big question. And so the things you were saying, Troy, about meeting people and engaging and learning, and I think that's where the beginning is. I don't think there's a simple answer, and I don't think it's going to happen very quickly. But I do think that there's a lot of amazing people that want to see this change. And we need to walk together in a good way, respecting and honoring one another on that journey.
Thank you. I just want to hang out with all of you. We have more conversations. This is so nice. So we did have another question about reconciliation, but I feel like we kind of answered that inadvertently when we were talking about this. It was blended together in there through story, which all we are is stories. And so I'm going to go to the final question. This will be our last question for the panelists. And after that, we'll move on to closing. So leaving on optimistic notes, and I know this word reconciliation means different things to so many different people. But to you, as individuals, I know we can't speak for entire nations, but for you, what are you most excited for the future? Or what are you optimistic about because of what you've seen or you're working on? So where's the hope? What are you excited for? And I'm going to start with Robert.
Thank you. What am I most optimistic about? I think my work, I'm constantly reminded about how grateful I am for this generation of youth. I think there's strength in this generation of youth. There's strength in diversity. There's a focus on being in relation. And I think youth today are they're at the front lines combating diverse issues around identity and space. And it's interesting because when I thought of these questions today, I wasn't really here as a representative nearly as myself. I think I represent every youth I've ever worked with. I'm trying to include those voices within the room. And I think for my community, oral history practice, oral tradition, it's law. So if I can speak to that practice, I'm optimistic that I will continue to do land-based learning with youth. I'm optimistic that I'll continue to respond to the voice of our youth. And I'm optimistic that we will continue to build community on the land. Those are the things that come up for me with this question. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know. Let's see. Well, I should know. I should be leading this, right? I have a hard time because I just want to like chat, but okay. I'm the boss, apparently. Meredith.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
What I'm most optimistic about is how the awareness is building and how the understanding. And I see so many people making a commitment to doing things differently. And I'm in awe of their courage. One of the things that always stands out for me, though, is the resilience of Indigenous people. Just the strength, and to walk in a way with what they've experienced, yet walk forward with a loving heart. To me, that's one of the most beautiful things I get to witness. Such generosity, such love, such kindness, and such inclusiveness. And I think that there is, in Canada, I don't know other countries, there's a willingness to come together so that we can go forward and become the village that Kathi talks about, that we're in that canoe and we are traveling. I think it holds a beauty and a hope and a promise for the future. Thank you.
Okay, Troy?
Yeah, very similar to the answers that we've already heard. Definitely the youth came to my mind as well, the younger generations. I think it's sometimes thought that in, traditional Indigenous ways and ceremonies are kind of a thing that's disappearing or of the past, but that's not. It's actually the opposite. There's more and more younger generations getting back into the ceremonies and trying to learn the language. I've met 15 to 17-year-olds who are learning to speak their traditional language fluently, and so there's those are really optimistic stories for me. Also, Indigenous scholars and Indigenous rights activists, to me, are a source of optimism. There's so much incredible frontline work that people are doing that I just think is just really important work. And I know sometimes it can cause controversy, and definitely lots of non-Indigenous and sometimes even Indigenous people can get upset with some of those frontline rights activists. But I just think it's really important work because it's really inviting us into this space of seeing, okay, there's something here that's really important to look at, and rather than just avoid it, we should be looking at it. And then yeah, the growing awareness among non-Indigenous people is really inspiring and an optimistic point for me as well too, like was already mentioned. I think all those things, I don't need to repeat what's already been said. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And Kathi?
In ceremony or at events, when I see little children in regalia and they're dancing and learning their language, and that I cry because it's full circle. We heal when we reclaim the things that were taken from us. And we eat our traditional foods and learn our traditional languages and do our ceremonies and start treating each other with love, respect, kindness, and generosity, like our did within our villages, and we step more firmly into our cultural identities. That fills me with hope. And I get to watch the lights come on for people from settler cultures in the work with Meredith and I do. And, I watch the they don't only learn cognitively, but with their hearts, and they get it and want to support the healing that's happening now sincerely. Every now and then we meet somebody that doesn't, and that's their journey. But the majority of the folks really, when they really understand the intergenerational impacts of colonization, they want to be a part of the healing. They want to change those systems that have been founded on racist ways of being. And, they put on their glasses of decolonization and they start using their voices. And I want to say, Meredith was so fabulous in that big system that we worked in before, about naming things that were steeped in colonial ways of being, and it did make a difference. So I am hopeful. I bring this stone everywhere I go. I am hopeful for the future, and yeah, you all fill me with hope too. Knowing I'm in the canoe with you and working together as one to take us to that place of reconciliation and decolonization and systems change, and so we can leave the world in better shape for the ones that are going to come after us. Berta was with me, before she passed, and Meredith and I, and she patted my knee. She said, "Kathi, we love all children, don't you?" And I said, "Oh yeah, it's obvious. A child comes in the room and we all stop and pay attention to the child." And she said, a lot of our children have mixed ancestry. She said, "Plus, we love all children." She patted my knee again and said, "That's why we build the canoe. We want to leave the world in better shape for the ones that are coming after us." And so thank you all, for the work that you're all doing.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, I don't want to go. I want to just take after and we can have tea and thank you, everyone. All of your stories, really, there's a couple of themes around like education with this last question, but especially around youth. And it made me think of a teaching, and I'll just share it quickly and then we'll close. Around, like the 7 generations and how every choice we make right now is it's not for us. It's not even for our children. It's not our grandchildren. It's not our great grandchildren. It's, 7 generations from now. And so there's that piece of hope for everything, even if it seems small right now, like those activists pushing boundaries, or it's an educator or someone working on the land or pushing against systems, which is really big work. 7 generations from now. Yeah. So thank you so much for your time, for your vulnerability and sharing, because sometimes when we're speaking about these big topics, it can feel intimidating because there's, 400, 300 people listening to us right now. So thank you so much for your time. I've really loved getting to know you through this and some of our prep. And thank you to Outward Bound Canada and to the organizers of this event. It's been lovely to have the space to share and listen and learn. So I have a really good day to the panelists. I'm going to welcome Andrew Young, our Outward Bound's executive director. He is going to share some closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to first thank all of the panelists for participating in the discussion today. I was sitting here the whole time listening, taking notes, and really just taking in all of the different perspectives and ideas. And I also want to thank everybody who's on the call who joined us today. Right now, we've got over 200 people here. I think at the peak there's 300 or 400 people. So just amazing to see folks showing up. I think there's lots to unpack and think about with the discussion today. The one kind of thing that really struck me through all of the discussion was just the different ways of thinking about land, through a colonial perspective or through an Indigenous perspective, and that some contrast there. And some of the panelists spoke about the colonial approach of nature being something that is to be conquered or used as something to extract resources from, and in an Indigenous perspective, it's more about being one with the land and one with nature, and the term being in relations, I think is really a powerful piece and a real strong contrast, I think, in terms of which maybe describes some of the system issues as well that was spoken a lot about. I even just think, really specifically about how we do land-based education or outdoor education from a, in that contrast, and the process for which, young people have to go through to sign up to do programs. And it's all, in the eyes of risk management and, the amount of paperwork that's required to get there. And I think that, as a practice, is one example, a very specific, small example of, well, maybe not small in some cases, of us trying to gain control over the process. And I'll leave. I won't. I'm going to rewatch this, and I think there's lots of learning there for all of us, including me in a big way. But I do want to also thank Josephine, who is the director of the Training Academy. As she said up the top, we've been fortunate to bring in the Training Academy program, which is trying to hit on a lot of the issues that were raised in the panel today about just bringing more diversity and representation into the outdoor sector. I also wanted to specifically thank Wilson Lasso, who's in the background, who's been the kind of coordinator of all of this activity today, and he's done an awesome job in bringing everybody together. And then, sorry, I've got a few notes. If you want to stay in touch with Outward Bound or learn more about the Training Academy or our programs, you can check us out on our website, our social media, those types of things. And just the last few things, if you would like to support our efforts as a youth-focused charity or learn more about the training with the Training Academy, sorry, I've said that already, check out the website. And then lastly, there's the upcoming National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And so we've done this intentionally in advance, but we will be sharing resources and places to learn more from Indigenous-led organizations and communities as well through email and social media. So, check those out. And that's it. I thank you all. It's great to see the panelists, and I wish we could all see everybody online, but it's been a great session, and thank you all again.